After 8 energetic years in the White House, Theodore Roosevelt retires from public life. At least, that is his stated intention.
Roosevelt is very gracious in 1908. He says, William Howard Taft is going to be president of the United States. I'm going to go off and travel in Africa and Europe and shoot great game and meet my friend the Kaiser and in general stay out of American affairs. And he goes off and vanishes into the bush. And William Howard Taft suddenly turns out to be not a very progressive Republican at all, and not at all like Theodore Roosevelt. The story is often told, actually, that sometime during the late years of Theodore Roosevelt's presidency, Roosevelt had William Howard Taft and Mrs. Taft over to the White House, and after dinner he said, "Bill, which would you like to have, the presidency or the Chief Justiceship of the Supreme Court?" And simultaneously, Bill said the Chief Justiceship of the Supreme Court, and Mrs. Taft said the presidency. And Mrs. Taft got her way first, although Taft did eventually get to be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. But he was much better suited to be a Supreme Court justice than he was to be president. He just didn't like that politicking that went on in the White House, and he would much rather have made sober decisions from the bench.
As Roosevelt's hand-picked successor, Taft easily wins election to the White House in 1908. Just 4 years later, however, Taft will leave office as the most decisively defeated president of the 20th century.
So you have this judicial conservative in the White House between 1908 and 1912. You don't have an open-door policy for journalists and other progressive thinkers the way you had during Roosevelt's presidency. This is not necessarily bad for progressivism. The progressives have to organize away from Roosevelt's charisma. So during Taft's presidency, you see the founding of a huge number of independent and private organizations that are associated with the progressive movement. The most conspicuous is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Persons, but there are any number of them.
Robert La Follette, former Wisconsin governor and now the state's senator, becomes the leader of the Progressive Republicans.
And then Theodore Roosevelt comes back from Africa and goes on the stump in the 1910 congressional elections and says, in effect, "I'll have my torch back now. Thank you, Bob." And there's a great deal of infighting among these three men, Taft, La Follette, and Roosevelt, in 1912. Taft gets the nomination. La Follette blows himself up by giving this offensive, self-aggrandizing speech to the press corps and sort of implodes as insurgent Republican leader, and the torch falls back to Roosevelt, who becomes the leader of the Progressive Party in that year. But it was an interesting interregnum while it lasted.
The election of 1912 is one of the most interesting contests in presidential history.
There are three candidates who are competing for essentially the same constituencies. The farmers, the laborers, the immigrants are all being sought by Theodore Roosevelt, the progressive candidate, Woodrow Wilson, the Democratic candidate, and Eugene Debs, the socialist candidate.
The Roosevelt of 1912 begins to match his interest in the large administrative state with questions of social justice. So he's the man in 1912 who endorses minimum wage legislation, who endorses corporate regulation and reform, who endorses the agenda of the social progressives and helps give them a political vehicle, which is extremely important for their cause. And finally, for moving Wilson in ways that he would not have gone on his own. Wilson is the man who is both deeply embedded in an American context and a cosmopolitan progressive at the same time. He's pushed in two ways. He's pushed in the campaign by Roosevelt, who takes most of the social justice progressives with him, much to Wilson's concern. And Wilson's also pushed by the American Federation of Labor, which is often thought to be highly apolitical in these years. It was not apolitical in the least. What it did was to try to pressure each one of the parties to come up with some of the planks that it had tried to insert in its own agenda of politics.
So Wilson, as a Democratic candidate in 1912, is running as somebody who supports progressive legislation, who is trying to pull in the Democratic Party's traditional constituencies of farmers and laborers, but who is also trying to present himself as inoffensive to the sort of upper middle class folks, sort of grabbable independent voters who voted for Roosevelt during his heyday.
Sometimes third parties can kind of upset the balance between the two parties by pulling more votes away from one of the two than the other, and in a close election making a difference. The other function that third parties historically have had, and that's to essentially bring issues into the agenda that the two major parties, they never ignore these issues, but they're not paying enough attention to them. They're too difficult for them to deal with. And when a third party does that and succeeds with that kind of an issue, that's a wake-up call to the two major parties. And one or the other of them is likely to try to co-opt, take that issue on.
William Howard Taft, resigned to defeat, barely campaigns at all. Roosevelt campaigns energetically until a would-be assassin's bullet sidelines him during the last weeks before the election. Wilson holds on to the Democratic faithful and eventually wins a plurality of the vote.
Roosevelt, of course, does the best of any other third-party candidate in history, and then Wilson pulls enough voters, even considering all that, to become president. So the size of the protest vote is so big that it can push all of these three candidates to unprecedented success in 1912, which, of course, tells you how unpopular poor Bill Taft was.